Hey Yuval, great to connect with you finally.
Nice to
Yeah,
be here.
so full disclosure, there was a time where I had a lot of sex educators on the podcast, and that's probably why your people found my podcast, I think.
Mm.
My interests have kind of moved away from that, but I was actually very interested in speaking with you because of your cultural and religious background, because one thing that is still very fascinating to me about sexuality is what it says about our unconscious. And I've said this many times on my podcast and how our sexuality and specifically what turns us on seems to be the last holdout of our individual nature against whatever's going on in culture. Like culture can change our beliefs, it can change our values, our perceptions, but it can't really change what turns us on. It can't really change what we desire. So I'd love to hear about that part of your background first, if you don't mind sharing, growing up in an Orthodox religious environment.
Absolutely. Um, so I grew up in a religious Orthodox Jewish community, as Orthodox as you can imagine it to be. So like boys only school. It's called Cheder, then yeshiva. I was actually born in a secular family. Interestingly enough, my parents were psychedelic hippies who were doing vipassana and breathing meditations in the mornings. But then we changed completely, and they sent me from Waldorf Democratic School to the opposite of that you can imagine,
What
to
caused
the
that
boys
change?
only. Um, I mean, who knows? But I think it's a combination. There was like a major life event when my dad had cancer and was going through an operation to take one of his kidneys out, and thankfully he's been very healthy and vibrant since. But I think the scare around that was like a big catalyst of, I think, a general sense of feeling lost or a loss of meaning in their life in that moment. That brought them. My mom came from a very Orthodox family, so it kind of like for her was going back to the roots in many ways. And I think they found the meaning that they were seeking in that religious fabric. They found structure, clarity, a sense of ease. Being in a community that is taking care of you. You don't have to constantly figure out the meaning of life, which for me felt like a prison, but for them, from where they came from and their life experiences, was exactly what they needed. And I spent my growing up from pretty much the age of 10 to the age of 17, where I left, in various Jewish Orthodox institutes, all of which were boys only, all of which were, if you're talking from the perspective of sexuality and sexual expression, going through puberty, were completely, there was non-existent. No sex education, no conversation about it whatsoever. No one ever told me that like masturbation is bad, but it's kind of insinuated. Like you feel like it's a sin. Like no one is actually telling you because it doesn't written anywhere in Jewish tradition. But it's somehow kind of leaked into the Jewish tradition from Christian purity culture and other things that we can talk about later. But somehow, I remember myself being 14 in the yeshiva and going through puberty and naturally having wet dreams and waking up wetting my bed, which is something that happens in your body if you don't masturbate for forever. And I remember feeling so incredibly guilty, so fearful of the sin that I just committed, even though I had zero control over it. And I would run away to the mikveh, which is a Jewish bathhouse that you go to purify yourself, to go and take a mikveh and then go and pray and ask for forgiveness and so on. So I remember this strongly, this sense of fear around that.
And how
Later
old were you?
on, I was like 14, 13, going through puberty.
Hmm.
Maybe
Hmm.
even, it was even maybe a bit later, maybe like 15. Yeah. Um, and yeah, I remember this very, very strongly. And of course, other aspects of it that were part of it. Later on, when I left around 17, 18, I went to the army first. So I was 3 years in the Israeli army. And finally, when I was out, I was already secular, and I had this hunger in me to go and explore everything. Everything that was suppressed came out in the most, in the strongest way possible, and I wanted to try everything, to eat the world. They cut my army ID, and I immediately, like 5 minutes later, I was out in the field looking at the sun, smoking a J, and ordering my first flight ticket out of Israel. And I didn't come back for like 2 years. I just was traveling around. And I remember having this deep longing for, by that time, I already had one girlfriend, my first girlfriend. We were each other's first. It was while I was in the army. And when I started traveling, we broke up, and I was kind of like open to the world. And I was like, I want to experience everything. Sexuality was a big part of it. I felt like this deep longing and desire to connect with women, to experience pleasure, to experience sexuality, to explore my sexuality. And I didn't know what the hell I'm doing. I felt so awkward around women. I didn't know how to even start communicating. And it took a while until it started coming more naturally. But that hunger initially opened me up to over a decade of exploration, basically, that I took human sexuality, intimacy, and particularly what you mentioned before, how our sexuality is expressed as a direct result of our inner relationship with ourselves, with life, with our belief systems. And here we are.
Cool. Yeah, so I was really curious because I had a similar path, I guess. I mean, not exactly those events, but I spent my 20s studying sexuality and exploring various things. But actually, I'm in a stage maybe similar to your parents that when they moved from like they moved into religion where there's something about not having to figure out life. And I just became a father, so I'm sure this is what triggered it. And I'm in this phase where I feel like kind of in between worlds, which is why I was so interested in speaking to you about this topic. I'm curious what you think now, because I assume you're in your 30s now. You're in this career. What do you think about your religious upbringing, let's say?
Well, it's interesting that you're asking, because I think the last about 2 years for me were almost three even, or a massive change happened. I feel like there was almost a development arc that I experienced, which I think a lot of people, maybe listeners or even you, can resonate with in some way, in which we come from a very oppressive perspective of some kind of orthodoxy or religious dogma. We break free from that with all of our might, wanting to just completely throw everything behind and march into the world and experience everything for ourselves. Usually we pick up other ideologies that are opposing to that, like atheism, nihilism, things of that nature. And then a lot of times I sense, at least in my experience, but it is being reflected back to me from a lot of people around me, we come back to our roots, but from a completely different perspective, a more integrated perspective. I feel like that for me, it was at some point, I mean, it's a whole story in and of itself, but I arrived to a place in my life in which I realized that, for lack of better explanation, because these direct experiences are very hard to kind of put in words, but I got to a place in which I felt deeply that nothing outside of myself can give me love as much as I can experience within myself and in every moment. The amount of love that is available to me. I realized that everything that everybody wants is love. That whatever I was ever seeking in external means, like sexual experiences, adventures, traveling the world, accumulating wealth, and so on and so forth, were all a deep longing for love. And when I found that love within myself, regardless of my circumstances, something really big shifted in me, which helped me see a lot of my roots in a completely different light. I came back to visit, respect, and honor the places I came from without the dogma. That I realized that what I was against was not the actual roots or where I grew up in, but rather the dogma that was built around it, was just made up of human experience and stories. And that there is a lot of deep wisdom in where I came from and all religious traditions, and that can be experienced from a completely different perspective, which gives it a completely different light and a completely different living experience. So that was kind of like my journey with it.
Hmm. Yeah, it reminds me of actually the biblical passage, the prodigal son, exploring, coming back, and there's something particularly beautiful than have never having left. So earlier you said something about Christian influence on like the dogma. Could you say a little more about that?
Yeah, obviously I want to preface that I'm not a scholar, nor in Christian nor Jewish tradition or mythology. But based on what I have learned, there is really no mention in regards to the sin of masturbation or sexuality. And actually, the original Jewish tradition and Jewish texts are pretty sex positive. It is regarded as something very sacred that should be done in intimacy between a husband and a wife, and so on and so forth, in a very traditional way. Nevertheless, there is none of that sinful baggage around masturbation and all that kind of stuff. And I think that's, as far as I know, and please, if there are any scholars out there, feel free to correct me. I'm not claiming that I know it all, but it sounds to me like it came more later on from more Christian streams of thoughts. I mean, there is in the Jewish Kabbalah, there is some mentions of how ejaculation or masturbation is like wasting your seed. If you're not doing it with a woman, there is something problematic about it. But it's not something that is taught or largely acknowledged in the tradition. And it's something that is much more apparent in Christian culture, which I know that in certain, I mean, obviously it's a very varied tradition in and of itself, many different churches, many different lineages. But generally speaking, at least Catholic churches and a bunch of others, it's something that is being taught, as far as I know, that like don't masturbate, don't touch yourself, like sex is a sin, sex before marriage is a sin, things of that nature, which really doesn't truly exist in Jewish tradition.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm also not a scholar, but from what I understand is, I mean, I really find ideologies in general fascinating and how what allows them to spread and how they follow many of the same principles as like biological evolution. And there's one thing that is clear with like Christianity that it did spread much faster than Judaism, and most likely because of certain things, certain controls that more ancient religions didn't have. Like they wouldn't have been able to amass these huge crusading armies if they didn't really control people's individual impulses.
Yeah.
If everyone was having sex the way they wanted to, they probably wouldn't have organized so well.
Exactly. That's what I'm always saying. Like people who are sex is always at the core of religious dogma, or not just religious dogma. We can talk about, generally speaking, about like capitalism and other modes of control and oppression. But sex is always at the core of these things. Like right now with the reversing of Roe v. Wade, for example, the trend of trying to take away women's reproductive rights, for example, or the freedom of women to choose partners or to have more freedom around their sexuality. It's not just one example of that happening in a capitalistic secular culture, but there is a lot more examples for that. But sex is always at the center of trying to control a population, because sexually liberated people are impossible to control. People who, I don't see sexuality as something that we do, but rather an expression of what we are. We are sexual beings. Sex is not just about the act of penetration. Sexuality is about being, sensing, vessel of sensory experience, of pleasure as a body, as a human being. And people who are liberated in that they can feel and sense and be and express themselves authentically in the world, well, they are harder to control,
Mm-hmm.
So that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. And then, well, you mentioned capitalism in that, especially in our era, and this has been true for many decades, that sex sells. So whereas maybe there are forces where you can't have too much sexuality on social media, not because social media companies are trying to hold a certain moral standard, but because they get advertising from, say, a Christian-based company where that's not okay. But then you also see, people's sexuality is obviously hooked to make them buy things, right?
Yeah.
It's actually very hard to have the population be free. And
Yeah.
maybe the general public, not everybody can be an individual. Like they're all going to hook into something.
It's those are big questions. I think ultimately anybody can be free, and then the question comes of what does it mean being free. I think there are all kinds of levels of relative freedom. When I'm saying freedom, I'm talking about a more ultimate one, which is an inner freedom, a sense that you can be in the world, express yourself the most authentic way possible in the world, having your needs being met, all of these kind of things, some of which are one's own responsibility to do the inner work necessary to arrive at, like going through some social conditioning and some childhood programming and all kinds of things to set yourself free in the way that you see and experience the world. But also, a lot of these things are being imposed on you. For example, I would love to offer my work for free to anybody who is, in need of that. And some cultures in human society would allow me to do that in abundance because they would support my life back because it was more community based. It was more, you know. But in this day and age, the systems that are in place don't really allow me to express myself in that way. I need to charge money for it. Just one example of how, systems that are in place that we put in place dictate how we express ourselves. And I think sexuality is the same way. What does it mean being sexually free? It can mean a lot of different things for different people, but the ultimate freedom in it will be to express yourself sexually in the way that is most authentic to your heart, to your unique human expression. And that is, a lot of it is our individual work to do, like to rediscover our body, rediscover pleasure, find out the relational dynamics that work best for us, learn to be honest and express ourselves, learn to um, look within and be more emotionally intelligent, and so on and so forth. But there are also systems in place that don't really allow us to be as sexually liberated as possible. For example, like you mentioned, social medias, certain legislations, especially towards women and people of indigenous people, people of color, transgender, LGBTQ, like all kinds of groups of people that have actual legislations in the law that infringe on their freedom of expressing themselves sexually and intimately in the world. So yeah, I think the question of freedom is this from both an individual and a collective perspective, and where am I, what kind of my freedom am I responsible for, and what do I acknowledge that is just being infringed upon me?
Hmm. I'm curious, have you worked with men or women from an Orthodox Jewish background, or maybe you're still in that culture?
I did. I had the pleasure of working with a few that were Jewish before, and I think one or two that were actually practicing Jews with like everything,
Hmm.
that I got to work. They got the pleasure to work with. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I had actually two experiences. This is when I was doing more sex education myself and living in Brooklyn. I had two clients, both men from the Hasidic Jewish community, fully immersed, both married, both were cheating on their wives, but they felt
Wow.
this confusion because they really believed in their religion, but their physical desire was too strong and it wasn't being met in their marriage. And actually, I was maybe 24 at the time. Honestly, I don't even know if I honestly helped them that much. I did my best, but I'm curious for someone who's still in that, how do you approach that when their physical desire is so against what's going on for their community or culture?
Well, I think there are a few conversations to be have about that. One is unrelated to your community or Judaism or any tradition, which is, the notion of honesty and open communication and involving your partner in the process of negotiating the relational dynamic that you decide that works for you, and staying true and committed and in integrity to it, which doesn't include cheating, obviously. Um, another another conversation, which is maybe the one that you are talking about, is how do you find peace within the tradition, which is one that I feel like I'm unqualified to answer because I haven't. I left. I have some friends, I have some colleagues. One in particular, if I can plug his name here, I highly suggest checking him out. His name is Zevi. He has a YouTube channel called Seekers of Unity. And he's originally a Chabad Hasidic rabbi, still is a practicing Jew, and his entire work revolves around finding the silver lining, the common thread in all the mystical traditions, in all religions, which ultimately in his work comes down to this direct experience, the direct mystical experience of universal oneness. And he speaks about it from Jewish perspective, from, he brings scholars from many other traditions, and he's very, very well read and well researched. It's a beautiful body of work. And he's doing just that. Like, his belief is that it's about time to bring about a revival, or like a freshness to the way that we approach Orthodox Judaism, and he's doing just that from within. And I think he's a much better scholar to kind of go and check out in that regard. But yeah, those are challenging questions. I think it's trying to stay within a very close-knit community that includes a lot of beautiful things, but also a lot of suppression, a lot of challenges for someone who wants to express themselves openly. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this is the ongoing thing that I'm experiencing with my family, because we both lived very hippie lives, my wife and I, through our 20s, exploring, doing our own thing. But now that we're a family, we want to have kind of stability, and we're trying to navigate, like, how much of our individualism do we want to, in a secular fashion, right? We weren't raised religious. Like, how much of our individualism do we want to drop in order to be part of a stable community, versus what we find in other hippie-ish spiritual families where everyone wants to live on land together. That's like the dream. Everyone wants to have that. But people who really are into this freedom lifestyle can never organize. Like, it's like it's the big trope. Like, hippies always want to get together and buy land, but they never can organize. So yeah, I mean, this is an ongoing thing that we're navigating even in a non-religious setting.
Yeah, I think it touches a very beautiful, ongoing human quarrel. There is this need for individuality and need for collectiveness, which we cannot do without either. Every time that we go for the collective while eliminating the individuality, there's a disaster. Every time we go into the individualism while disregarding the collective, obviously look at the United States and many other places, it's a disaster. There is another beautiful philosopher, writer, Daniel Schmechtenberger, is also Jewish. He's talking a lot these days about he calls it the meta crisis, which is exactly talking about that. Like, how do we find meaning and good stories that serve us to collectively engage with, to build community around, to collect as big of a community as possible, while at the same time not forgetting the individual freedom, which a lot of times infringe upon each other. Like, if the collective is what matters, you get on the other end of the spectrum, you get regimes like China and Stalin, USSR, and things like that, and North Korea. And on the other hand, you have, if you go all the way to the individualism, you get societies like the United States, in which people who work to death and don't have the simplest security of their healthcare and their a roof over their head to rely on, among many other problems that individualism creates. I feel like, and this is just my personal thing, that there is a story that we can all relate to, that we can all find to be true in a self-evident way without relying on religious dogma, that can also hold religion. So without denying religion, so without denying anybody's belief system, and without denying people's individuality. I feel like, and it's not something new, and it's not something that I've invented, it's something that has existed since ever. And it has to do with the direct experience that everything is inherently interconnected. You can see trails of that understanding in all religious traditions, in all mystical traditions, in poetry, in philosophy, um, everywhere that you look at, in science, whatever lens you're choosing to look at reality, even the scientific lens, whether it's biology, physics, astrophysics, quantum physics, no matter how deeply we look, nothing ever suggests that things are more separated than we once thought. If you look the lens of biology, the more you understand about things, the more it shows you how everything is working in cohesive interconnectedness, that nothing works not in relationship with everything else. If you look at physics, astrophysics, mathematics, everything will suggest the same thing. And I think philosophy and spiritual traditions and mystical understandings will point out to the same direction. So whether you explore it from without or from within, we all arrive always to the same conclusion of this universal understanding of oneness, in which everything is constantly touching and being touched by everything else, and everything is one big ecosystem. And that as a result of that understanding, we see that human beings have not been created, but emerged. And that God, or what we refer to as God, can be known as that oneness rather than this man-made human-like figure with feelings and emotions out there in the sky there to judge you. And I feel like such understanding can provide a deep sense of connectedness and meaning that we all need in order to form systems and inform legislation and inform societies and build and gather around certain ideas that help us live together. And at the same time, it doesn't infringe on anybody's individuality. It doesn't oppose any religion. It doesn't oppose any belief system. You can be your own individual self, because within this grand sense of interconnectedness web of things, you are a unique expression of that aliveness. You can only do you. Every human being is its own unique path. No one else can do that. No one else can express relationships in the way you do. No one else can have the same expression of sexuality. No one else have the same relationship with God or divinity as you have.
Yeah.
It's something that is deeply alive in me right now. So I'm happy that you asked that. Yeah.
Yeah. Actually, this reminds me of a few things. I actually forgot about this. There's a talk by a journalist named Lex Pelger who I was acquainted with that I saw a long time ago about the kink community. He did like a in-depth dive into kink, and he was basically going through how there've always been people with unusual sexual desires, but they couldn't find each other, right? They were all like maybe one in every town. It was into some specific fetish or whatever. But since the internet, they can actually find each other and get together and do things together that they're actually aligned. Like their individual natures happen to be aligned because geographically that doesn't happen with sexual desires, with kinky things, right? And then it reminds me of another thing of Balaji Srinivaswan. I mean, I don't know how to say his last name, but the guy who made the big Bitcoin bet earlier this year wrote a book about how the future of nations. He was saying that the nation state model really doesn't work for similar reasons, right? Like people in a given area don't always agree, as you can see in the United States. But if people can organize instead based on their ideology, like everyone who believes in this about gun control is part of this nation, and this nation, people who believe in free sexual expression go to this nation, people who want to control that go to this nation, that reorganization would actually fit a lot better than the lines drawn on a map. And maybe that is a solution to the individual sexual or individual expression with fitting in with legislation in the world.
I mean, I'm open, but I think that ultimately, if we look at ideology is very limited, because ideology is something that is ever in flux, ever changing. People can change their minds. People have different takes on different aspects of their life based on different experiences that they've had. And then one person is into this type of legislation about something, but not about this one. So how, like it feels to me like it will be even more complicated. We need something far more universal than that, like far more self-evident. Like some things are just interesting to me that they're even on the table as a question. Like, of course, when it comes to someone's belief system, everybody should have their own freedom to express themselves in whichever way they feel like, in whichever relationship they have with reality, with themselves. But the pathologically weird way that is happening maybe more than anywhere in the United States right now is that these groups of people feel that it's their responsibility and in their power to enforce those ideologies on everybody else's right to express themselves. And that's something that is really weird and is pretty new in human society. In the scale of the 10,000 years, or 70,000 years of human societies, it's just, I don't know, like 5,000 years. um, all this idea that like a group of people can enforce their own ideology on everybody else, whether it's by the religion, by the state power, or whatever. Human societies have lived in far more universal, far more accepting, far more tribal based, and nevertheless, just as complex and nuanced ways for many, 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 many years before that, based on what we know and what we gather. I think that this idea that we cannot come to an agreement, and it's all so polarizing and so complex, is a bit confusing. I think that there is a way to make sense of things. But yeah, I don't know. It's way
Yeah.
above my pay grade
Yeah.
to solve these things.
Yeah. And actually, I want to get back to sexuality, but yeah, I think a lot of the issues is just the fact that we're not meant to be in tribes this big. Like a Paleolithic
Yeah.
tribe, they would kind of come to a consensus and they would basically agree because they would have to. But when you have 300 million people, there's no way that's possible.
Yeah.
But I made a note because you mentioned, I think, just an example about Jewish mysticism and what maybe we could call semen retention, which is something that many very ancient traditions touch on in some way, something about, semen having life force. I know I've seen a couple of your short videos on it. I'm curious what your take is on it in general, especially with the modern version being no fap or the term semen retention thrown around a lot.
Yeah, so it does seem that this kind of practice of refraining from ejaculation and learning to move sexual energy existed in different traditions. Certain yogic practices and traditions, and certain Taoist traditions, and other Chinese lineages, and probably some others that I don't even know about. Usually, good ideas are kind of collectively emerging individually in different places when their time comes. I think that the issue with trying to take these practices and bring them to a modern person is very problematic. For once, because it doesn't take into account the lifestyle, the complexity, the range of practices associated with this particular practice that would allow a practitioner to practice something like that. For example, in yogic traditions, the people who would do something like that was not householders who work for a living and have a wife and kids. It was people who were meditating and doing yoga their entire lives, eating a very strict vegetarian diet, which, by the way, suppresses, at least to some degree, your sexual urges and life force energy. And then you take that, which is, by the way, it's not just a problem that is unique to semen retention or practices of that nature. It's also in the entire New Age world of taking bits and pieces of ancient practices from here and there and trying to throw them all together into some new version of modern thing, of like some form of individualistic, capitalistically oriented way of self-actualization, without taking into account the very complex, very nuanced systems that those individual practices were sitting within, like moral, philosophical, practical, lifestyle, things that were associated with that practice. With semen retention in particular, this is one example. So I think personally that this practice in it of itself has no place in a modern modern person's life, like you and I, who has a partner and do work for a living and things of that nature. That being said, and also another problem that I find with that is that because it lacks the nuance of the traditions, it's very easy, together with the contextual existence of practices like no fap, for example, like not touching yourself at all or refraining from any sexual activity, together with all of that, it can create a certain ideology, a certain frame of thinking that has to do with a lot of shame and guilt. Somehow in some way ejaculating is like a bad thing, or like ejaculating, I'm depleting my life force, or some whatever, something like that, which by the way has no corroborating evidence anywhere else. It's not really the point. It's not that if you ejaculate, you deplete yourself from life force. So all of that being said, I think that there is definitely some value in experimenting with your own habits, your own sexual habits, the way that you engage with your own pleasure, the way that you touch your body, what kind of experiences, emotional, mental experiences you have around touching your body, the way that you're doing it, the way that you are experiencing self-pleasure, and playfully, curiously experimenting with trying to prolong ejaculation for certain periods of time and see what it does to your sexuality, to your body, to your relationship with your partner, things of that nature, but without calling it semen retention, no fap, or thinking that you're doing something like whatever, something special, something ancient practice or something like that. Because,
Yeah, I
we
mean,
know.
it basically. Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was just saying it actually is kind of the same thing as the ideological question. Maybe this philosophical question that can't be answered of does do the masses really want full freedom? Or are they capable of freedom? Or are they capable of nuance? Because actually, what you're saying, I agree. My biggest criticism of NoFap is not the idea of it in itself, right? Like, especially for someone who's maybe addicted to porn or has a very unhealthy relationship to it, unconscious relationship to it. It is abstention, maybe for a period of time, is a good idea, but the way it's portrayed on YouTube, let's say, is the same thing as like political slogans. When you see people campaigning, it has to be reduced to something really small and bite
Yeah,
size, and it can't have nuance. And it reminds me, I don't know if you ever read the book Animal Farm, but there's the whole thing about how the pigs are the geniuses, but then the sheep can only remember a few words. So they have to reduce communism to 4 feet good, 2 feet bad, and they can't remember anything else. And it's kind of like no fap. It's like, oh, not coming good, coming bad. And I think that's what
yeah,
most people take it to be.
yeah,
And there's nothing beyond that. Whereas there is so much complexity, and really, I think the most important thing is choice, right? If you're not able to control your impulses, or more specifically control how much arousal you can contain before you discharge, it's better to have choice, and then you can do whatever you want with the choice.
yeah.
And that could be said about culture and religion and everything else, but sexuality certainly.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think it's definitely, especially if you're experiencing something around sexuality that you feel personally, not because someone told you, but you feel that is in some way detrimental to your overall well-being and sense of thriving in life. Let's say your pornographic consumption, or the way that you touch yourself, or the feedback that you are getting from lovers, or whatever it is that you feel that something wants and calling for your attention there, go there. Like, what do you actually experience? Instead of telling yourself, porn bad. Like, okay, keep doing what you're doing, but become more aware of how you're doing it, right? Like, a lot of men watch porn and then unconsciously, just like, furiously, as fast as possible, just ejaculate as quickly as possible. Keep watching porn, let's say, see what happens, see how you feel. Touch yourself maybe more slowly. Pay attention to the emotional sensations that you feel in your body. Pay attention to the thought patterns that you have. Pay attention to the subtle sensations of pleasure in your body. And in my experience, in my own life, working with a lot of men around these topics, is that the desire to watch porn usually naturally dissolve by itself. Not because you called yourself a porn addict and try to discipline yourself out of watching porn, but because you became so deeply aware and so incredibly joyful in your own connection with your body and with your pleasure, that it became meaningless. It became like suddenly you're watching mainstream porn and it doesn't even activate you sexually because you see through the illusion. You see how performative it is. You see how there is no real portrayal of female pleasure. You see a lot of things through it, and suddenly all the fake noises and genitalia oriented, you know, angles of the camera just turn you off, you know. So I think far more important than how long you will last and how much you ejaculate and how hard you get and if you watch porn or not watch porn and all these like super oversimplified, lacking nuance kind of statements is what is your, like, explore your relationship. If there is something in your life that you feel is not going the way you want to and giving you some angst, maybe it's calling you for some deeper level of contemplation and awareness. Pay attention. I have a colleague that advises men to move their body more while they're watching porn, for example. Like move your hips, move your body, like be more active in that rather than this super passive consumption, right? But yeah, ultimately, I don't give people these like clear-cut advices of like, that is bad, that is good, you know? And I think, like you said, being a more nuanced educator is complicated because usually my nuanced opinions don't get as viral as my very simplistic kind of tips and tricks or like a very oversimplified statement that I would make, you know. It attracts people who are ready for nuance, you know. But those are good
Yeah.
questions, you know.
Yeah, it's hard. I mean, most people don't. Actually, I just had like this small argument. I'm visiting my family right now, and I had this small argument with my dad because I saw him watching the news, and they had like some clip show editing something, and then they painted it a certain way. And I had actually watched the full video of this person speaking, this politician. I was like, well, that's actually not what happened. And then my dad and I got into a bit of an argument, but he was basically like, I don't have time to watch the whole video. And I was like, yeah, okay. That
Fair
is
enough.
true when it comes to most people. When it comes to sexuality, when it comes to anything, people just want the bite-sized
Yeah.
thing because they have other things going on.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, I haven't thought about it from this perspective, but it's really true. You know, it's true about a lot of things. A lot of things that are very relevant to our culture right now. Like you look around and people on all sides of the political spectrum are fighting about these like slogan-like things without like the nuanced substance of a lot of the conversation that is necessary to have in order to really. But like you said, a lot of people are just not ready, don't want to. Like it's yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, and it takes a lot of energy. It takes a lot of, yeah, it burns a lot of calories to take on someone else's perspective and realize you want the same thing. It's just a lot of work.
Yeah.
uh, on that, another thing I wanted to speak to you about was shibari, because I heard you speak a little bit about it with Cam. It's not something that I've practiced lately, honestly, since having a child. A lot of things have fallen away, but I had a similar experience, and I would love to hear your take on discovering it and how you've grown as a person from it.
It appeared in my life. Look, I always knew that it existed since I got into the kinky BDSM sphere communities and started exploring them around the world and participating
Oh,
and
and sorry,
facilitating.
just in case anyone doesn't know, shibari is Japanese rope bondage. In case a
Yeah,
listener doesn't
yeah.
know.
So shibari basically is the original meaning of the word, which was used. It's like a set of notes that were used to tie up prisoners originally. And then it was reframed completely in a completely different kinky context. And it's called kinbaku, which is basically the art of erotically tying someone, or being tied. And so I was aware of its existence. I've seen like work of arts of different masters for, I don't know, probably knew about it for like 8 or 9, 10 years now. But it only started becoming part of my life. In one of my previous relationships, my partner expressed their desire to play with it. So I bought the simplest, not even proper shibari ropes, but just a simple cotton ropes and started playing and seeing some tutorials. It's only later on, like I think it was 2018, that I was in Japan for a business trip, and I decided to take advantage and reached out to a very known master, Steve Osada. I think he's still alive and practicing in Japan. He's very old. Um, and I went to a private 3 hour session in his studio in Tokyo, which was very was mind blowing. I completely fell in love with the experience because fortunately he didn't teach me as much of technique as I've learned in the next couple of years from different teachers. He gave me the overall principles. And he has such a beautiful way of transmitting it without telling me exactly everything. He was just like in the way that he led me, in the way that he spoke about things, in the way that he just held himself in the space with the model that we were working with. I just learned a lot about how to hold space for someone, how to energetically be in a space, how to do power dynamics without even saying anything yet. Like really in the way that you hold yourself, in your intentions. Um, I got hooked, and I think I kept like experimenting, studying online and from different teachers. It was only in 2020 when the pandemic hit, and I found myself stuck in an island in Thailand, and I met
Oh, wait,
my
were you in Copenhagen?
yeah.
Ah, I was there for lockdown as well.
Really? Oh wow!
Yeah, where were you? I mean, no one listening will know the places, but where were you on the island?
I was at the north of the island in
Ah, I was in
the
Chalaklom.
Bay Villas, so not far from
Ah, okay,
Chalakun.
cool, cool. Yeah, I was on lockdown on the beach, which was amazing because no one could stop you from going to the beach. But
It was unbelievable. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. So I met Tati Limati. She's also a phenomenal rope master. This is her entire like life and mission. And because there was nothing else to do around the pandemic, we basically met 3 times a week for private sessions for a few months. So I got to learn a lot and much more kind of in depth from her. Um, and then over the years since then, like I got super into it and then incorporated it in my life in certain degrees. And now it's just like a practice that I do here and there, not something that I do all the time, just when the moment asks for it. I think that what it taught me overall is really helped me with accumulate and hone very subtle sensitivity to holding a space, to being with someone in the space and allowing someone to safely fall into surrender, to feel comfortable enough to really, really let go physically, emotionally, mentally. Rope was just for me a tool, a very versatile and very powerful tool for that, for achieving that. But ultimately, that is what it taught me. I think beyond that, I really love the aesthetic aspect of it. I really love, obviously, the super kinky, erotically intriguing power dynamics that involved with that. Um, but I think the main thing is the energetic stuff. Like it has such,
hmm
I think, unlike a lot of tools, toys, and props that you find in the BDSM community, like leather stuff, the rope has a certain subtlety to them. It's not just more aesthetically pleasing, but it's also much more versatile and subtle and soft. There is a certain softness to power dynamic involving rope versus a lot of power dynamics that are involving kind of mainstream, let's say,
hmm
BDSM kind of tools that I like personally.
Yeah, I had a similar experience because for a while, even after studying sexuality, there's some things I didn't get, like powered like dominance. I had lovers who were asking for it, but it was so in my head, like I didn't understand. I didn't understand anything. And then even after seeing some rope demos, I was drawn to the logic of tying knots, but I still didn't get the point. And then in Bali, I had a similar experience where I finally saw someone who really got it, and I can see or feel the perhaps energetic side of. I mean, on a literal level, that's about as surrendered as someone can be when they can't move. Like in any other scene, they can get up and leave, but if they're tied up, they literally it's like as physically vulnerable as you are. which puts so much responsibility and care on the top's end. And like something clicked in me of like, oh, this is what consensual dominance is. Like you're really taking responsibility for someone's well-being, as opposed to what I was more used to of approaching sexuality from like a purely service, like, are you enjoying this thing, as opposed to I'm going to take us, or I'm going to guide you to a place that you'll hopefully open.
It's interesting that you're bringing that point up because I think it's like a full circle. So if, let's say, vanilla, there's no really such thing, but just for the sake of this thing, I don't like, there is no shame in any expression of human sexuality, and everything can be wild and strange and kinky and beautiful. But just like non-power dynamic based kind of sexual dynamic. And like you said, it's a lot of times it comes from a place of service. Like I'm here for your pleasure, trying to, like you tell me what to do, and it's focused on your pleasure and so on, versus suddenly taking the leadership. So I feel like that shift happened for me when I got into BDSM and kink and started learning about power dynamics. Rope brought me to a whole other level of full circle with the same skill, because with the rope, I realized that even that leadership is not about dominance. It's not about taking the leadership, but rather becoming such a good listener to what the moment is asking for. With the rope, I find myself coming to a place in which, yes, I am the responsible leading this situation, but at the same time, I don't do anything. It self-emerges out of the moment. I am becoming such a listener to the moment with energetic subtleties to a person's body and their reactions. And it's almost like I switch my mind off and I allow the person and the rope to lead me. And therefore I lead them, if that makes any sense. Like it's both being in service and taking leadership combined. I don't know if that makes any sense. Let me know. But
Yeah, and
I'm
it's
trying to
reminding me
convey
of
something that
this.
is a bit subtle.
Well, it's reminding me of actually kind of a Jungian perspective on. I mean, he didn't use the term kink, but like the psychodrama of archetypes, like even just like the power dynamic fantasy, which for me, coming from a very logical perspective, didn't make any sense. Particularly from like, why would a woman or anyone drawn to being a bottom, why would they want that? And maybe there's not a really concrete answer, other than perhaps we're playing out these like ancient psychodramas that are deeper than us. Like even rope, as you're pointing out, I didn't know that was the history of shibari, but a way to tie prisoners. Like there is something. It doesn't even mean that you have a personal thing in your past, but something ancestral about playing this role, where typically a more, it doesn't have to be man and woman, but very often it's like men are more drawn to the top position and women are more drawn to the bottom,
Actually, not
because of something that,
necessarily, surprisingly enough.
I don't know. I mean, well, just and my
We'll
anecdotal
talk about it in a
experience has
moment.
been
Yeah.
in general. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And it's perhaps playing out this ancient drama where it was done in an unconsensual fashion over many generations. But because that memory is in us, there's an opportunity for arousal, pleasure, and energy in playing out these characters that maybe you've never experienced that in your life, right? It's not like many people who have never experienced sexual abuse have rape fantasies. Where does that come from? Perhaps the last 10,000 years of this just occurring.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that it's an interesting point that you're bringing up. Like we are playing out these ancient dramas. Um, the way I always thought about it is that there is a more inherent, almost spiritual longing in all of us to let go, to surrender, to find our true nature by letting go of the constraints that hold us as a separated sense of self, which part of them is the way that we see the world, the thought patterns that we have, the need to constantly try to control reality and mold reality into our own likings and our own particular set of preferences. And to me, this deep desire, whether conscious or unconscious desire to let go and surrender, which by the way, there is not enough research about it, but at least the studies that have been done so far, some that I've seen, actually more men express the desire to be submissive and to let go And then a lot of the women who took these studies, which by the way, statistics, whatever, it can be, it can be, it can change. But I would say that it's generally speaking, on an inherent level, on an objective level, I think any human being has the deep longing for both. It's just that maybe cultural conditioning made some of us want or think that we align more with one and more of the other. But personally, I think that everybody will be empowered by experimenting and exploring all sides of the equation. And I would go even
Totally.
farther than that, that at least in my own experience, and please nobody take offense, I'm not coming at you individually, but you can't really be a truly good dom without experiencing how it feels like being submissive. Just like I wasn't a very good shibari rigger before I have experienced being tied up quite a few times. It's just there is a certain level of subtlety and understanding of someone else's experience that if you don't have, it's hard for you to truly lead them gracefully into that experience. And I think this talking about cultural context and conditioning, men more than anybody will benefit a lot, I feel like, from exploring these realms of being penetrated, of submitting to a woman and following her lead and like letting her take the leadership and so on and so forth. But it's interesting that the point that you brought, I never thought about it from that Jungian perspective. I always thought about it from a more kind of like deep heart longing to just let fucking go sometimes, like to,
Yeah, and they're not mutually exclusive. Like that letting
yeah,
go isn't random, right? Maybe perhaps it comes from something.
yeah,
Yeah, and my personal experience has been similar. I mean, again, just my own experience, but uh, I found so much resistance when I first became interested in DS. I actually preferred almost the submissive role, and I think because my conditioning maybe was the opposite, where like it was bad for a man to be dominant or in control, and I think in some ways maybe I was even afraid of the responsibility. Um, so when I dipped in, I actually preferred the less physically responsible role. But when I actually had the courage to explore the dom side of things, something like unlocked and opened up that had so much energy behind it that all the other things I tried were very pale in comparison. And maybe it was because of my resistance. Maybe it was my individual nature that I had been repressing, or some combination of many factors.
yeah. Yeah, generally speaking, going to the direction of what challenges you and kind of you're afraid of is a lot of times where your most transformative experiences will be. So that makes total sense.
Yeah, yeah. So we covered a lot of fun topics. Where can people find out more about your work?
They can find out about me in social media. Just search Yuval Mann or my website, yuvalmann.com. I'm pretty easily find findable.
Cool. Do you have anything coming up that you want to share, or any things you've been working on lately?
I mean, I'm working now. I took this whole project of revisiting, retouching the content in my video courses. I feel like, they say that if you're watching back on your old work and you're not cringing, you haven't done any growth. Um, so I've gone through some of my courses, which I've created quite a few years ago, and they're still incredible. But there was this personal cringe that I had. It was like, oh, I could have said that better. I could have, expressed that a little bit more eloquently. Maybe that thing I don't resonate with as much anymore. Like, for example, some feminine, masculine stuff that I used to speak about that is not part of my practice anymore. And I have deeper perspective on. So I'm kind of like retouching and creating a lot of the content in the courses. So this is something that is pretty exciting, and I'm really looking forward to putting it all together. But yeah, other than that, the deepest work that I do is the one-on-one work that I do with people. Um, yeah, it's always the most rewarding, the most exciting is like experiencing my own journey through another person's unique human experience and experiencing the revelations and the transformations all over again, again and again and again through these different people's eyes, using their sexuality and sexual expression, but nevertheless touches every aspect of life. And that's very exciting.
Awesome, man. Yeah, well, thanks for coming on. This is great.
Thank you for having me, man. Fun conversation.